Awesome. Hey, Zeena, how are you doing?
Hi, good morning, May, or
Good.
afternoon, depending on where you are.
I'm in Paris, so it's evening for me. I feel like this is like
Ah,
multicultural and like a new European US way. So that's great.
you're very global right now.
Exactly. Right. Awesome. Well, I'd love to introduce you because I think our audience deserves to know more about your background. Yeah, so let me just start. Zeena is the head of brand digital at the North Face. She's also the co-founder of a nonprofit, the Asian American Collective, and a podcast host and producer, and an Adweek 2022 executive mentee. Zeena has years of experience in digital marketing, music, production, and podcasting. To give you a little bit more info about her creative background, Zeena is a lifelong singer and performer, and she started out as a vocalist in local bands, which I think is very cool. And she later pivoted using her music and business skills to become a digital marketing executive at Roadrunner, Motown Capital, and Atlantic Records. In 2008, she added journalism and broadcast to her impressive skill set as a radio host on Sirius XM and a writer and VJ for publications like Vice, Revolver, Uprocks, Vader, and Mass Appeal. Very cool. And then since 2015, Zeena has hosted and produced several podcast series, including Ladyish, Box Talk, and Revolver's weekly podcast. She's currently the producer of the podcast, Everything's Political. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. God, it sounds crazy.
No, it's awesome.
Listening to that, I'm like, why do I do so many things? For sure.
The
I
breadth,
get
the breadth
bored
and
very.
depth, it's great. That's awesome. Great. So I'd love to just kind of set the stage for this talk about multicultural marketing. How would you define what you do in terms of multicultural marketing?
Well, I would say first, I'm a lifestyle marketer, right? A lot of people have asked me like, what a transition from the music industry and kind of music and media, which pretty much go hand in hand at a certain point, to brands and brand building. And it was never a stark contrast for me because it's all lifestyle marketing when you really boil it down. And something that I'm very conscientious of because I am a lifestyle marketer is the fact that a lot of these different communities, and we'll dig into this, but like you can, appropriate them as a multicultural community or just marginalized community, other places, that aren't being represented at current, like all of those different communities really converge into one to create pop culture, right? So for me, multicultural marketing was an inevitable part of what I do, also being someone of a BIPOC background. It's just very personal to me to raise awareness by financially investing in these things, bringing it to the forefront, really questioning cultural norms that have been established. Sometimes we don't even realize our cultural norms at a certain point, right? We're just like kind of going. I think that has been really rewarding, especially at this part of my career in brand building with such, prolific brand that really has put a lot of investment in the nonprofit community and in building equity for the outdoors. So, multicultural marketing, I think, is something that we've talked about here and there in some of these forums. And I've been thinking a lot about lately what it means to be multicultural, right? I think in the past, maybe in the 90s, the early 2000s, multicultural can be deemed more racial and more in different racial and ethnic backgrounds. But I do think like as we begin to converge and the world becomes a melting pot, people are more multiracial, right? And come from different backgrounds and also identify differently. Like we're in Pride Month, I just actually wrote a piece recently, which should be out soon, about pride and identity and pride and how diverse even the queer community has become and the tensions there. So I think like we all are multicultural at this point and drawing from different references. So taking it through the lens that's not exclusively racial, I think is really important in 2022 as a marketer and as a lifestyle marketer. And it's really exciting to see a lot of these things start melting into one, but also like carving out and distinguishing each individual identity to be recognized and revered.
Awesome. Yeah. And then, there's so much talk now about DEI. How do you look at multicultural marketing? Is it first DEI or through a DEI lens? What would you kind of say about that?
Ooh, I would definitely say, actually, just I wrote something here, so I was going to pick it up. I would say DEI is the lens, right? Because when you're thinking about multicultural marketing, whether again it be hitting these different touch points that are outside of just like racial diversity, you have to also look, so like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. you think of diversity racially, that's kind of the OG. And then diversity of thought and approach, I think is really, really important to consider as a marketer, because there are so many different thoughts and approaches. And when you have an audience that's cast as a wide net, and you can really get that feedback in real time, right? Like this is the first time I think, like in, you know, marketing's history.
Oh yeah, on social, you're going to find out if it was a hit or a miss, or both.
Or even if they don't care, they're going to chime into the conversation. It's always that friend that you're like, why are you speaking right now? There's
troll me right now.
So many of those out there, right? So just kind of like honoring and understanding what that diversity of thought and approach is extremely important. And also understanding that that may not necessarily be your consumer. That might just be an opinion in the mix, right? And I think that's really hard for a lot of companies, especially at the highest levels, to rectify, because when you see bad thoughts being aired out in a public forum, it's just really important to understand that those are just thoughts. That doesn't necessarily mean that that consumer or their behavior is going to follow up with that, right? And the way that you defend your stance is extremely important, right? Because if consumers see you basically saying nothing, inaction is an action, right? And you are not really leaning into that diversity and really like substantiating your work if you're doing that. And I would say the equity side of things, it really is like equal visibility and creating systemic equitable environments. And that means for obviously the forward facing piece, you know, your consumer work and what you're doing in the marketing side, but it also means internally, right? Like if you're not building, if your roots are not watered, then you might as well cut down the tree, right? Because if they can't be planted and they're not nourished, and the people who are doing the work don't feel that there is an equitable environment, that work is going to be insidious and it's going to seep in, and it's not going to allow people to do the best work possible. And then with inclusion, which I think it's really hard to define what inclusion is and not go nuts and think of the entire world, right? It's daunting as a marketer. You're like, but what about this person and that person? And we have to funnel efforts and budgets and all of these things that are just realities, right? Like we're talking in realities as marketers, because we know that there's a finite budget. There's a finite amount of resources. We could be doing this 24 hours a day and still not hit the mark, right? It's really the sense and the sentiment of bringing people in and allowing stories to then become part of your story as a brand. And finding those right partners, I think, is key for that, because it allows you to genuinely and authentically align with those communities. And if you look at things through that lens, then it all kind of ties together these pieces of multicultural marketing and makes it feel authentic, which I think is, you know, always the aim for any of these kind of campaigns.
Totally. I know. Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, in terms of like, how do you actually find that authenticity? Because I think it's something that we talk about a lot in influencer marketing and with content creators. But is there kind of like a bellwether test that you apply to any of your marketing, or what do you think?
I mean, the authenticity has to be true to your brand message.
Yeah.
Because there's really no other way to gauge it, right? Like it could be authentic to the creator or to the influencer, which is great. But if you're doing a collaboration as a brand, like you really want to make sure that those two pieces complement and align with each other, and messaging wise, they mirror each other, or they're complementary to each other. And that's where I think the authenticity kind of like rises to the top, right? It's when you stretch out and you're trying to do something maybe a little funky or different, which does work in the tech world, right? Like if you're doing something on the tech side that might be a little weird and different from a functionality and UX standpoint. But I think when you're talking about cultural and multicultural marketing, there's a sensitivity that needs to be assessed, right? So when you look at the temperature of current culture, and by the way, you could start a campaign, things could be great. You could develop the whole campaign, shoot the campaign, and then by the time it gets something completely crashed down immediately, like a week or a day before. We've all seen it happen. It's happened to all of us, which is always a bummer when you put a lot of—
can we pause that? Because we really need to pause that.
Yeah, I've had a few of those happen in my time. So, you know, it's like you try your best, right? And one thing that I think I've seen a bit of a curve in the last year, we had a really huge spike in cancel culture maybe 2 years ago when everyone was in the house, like with the magnifying glass, right? Looking at every single detail and trying to expose every single thing. And, I think that there was some value to cancel culture for sure, because a lot of things hadn't been called out in the past, but there's also a huge risk with being that extreme and life is just not black and white like that. So I have seen a bit of a turn of that and a little bit more of an educational lens and understanding, especially like in pop culture. I feel people are, really taking that on in their hearts and really trying to explain and have these more fruitful dialogues that at least have like, a different kind of lens. So whether or not you hit the mark and authenticity and like, it's very specific to your brand, I do think that you will always learn every time you do a campaign or work with a partner, what kind of works for your community and what the perception is. And then you have to kind of take the bits and pieces of that and like decide, overall, were your objectives met, or like, were you gaining the audience that you were trying to kind of like establish authenticity with? So it's always a constant checks and balances and figuring out if you did it right or not.
Awesome. And then, you just hit on talking about like inclusivity as part of DEI. And it's like, hey, we want to be inclusive of everyone, but how do you really know then what to prioritize and what to focus on, and like what your marketing team is going to do today and what your messaging is going to be?
I think you have to make a choice because again, like everybody is everybody, right? And the definition of everybody keeps growing and becoming more granular over time, right? We are living in a time where TikTok redefines like norms and conventions by definition solely daily, right? Like there's a new term that pops up and there's a validity to that, right? Because people are finding different identities and we're learning more than ever on a global scale about who people are. So I think you have to prioritize. And I think we're moving a bit past the time period where it was about commemorative months. Let's celebrate Pride only, right? Or let's do Black History Month. Like all of these initiatives and inclusion like lenses need to be carried through everything that you're doing year round. And I do think that a lot of other, a lot of companies have grappled with it because again, there's a lot of resources and thought, and you want to make sure that you're hitting the mark within that time period too, so you don't show up absent, but it needs to be very intentional and you need to build little by little. And I think once you, identify where you want to start, that at least gives you an area that you can win in and continue to build in. And little by little, then you can add each of those layers and decide whether or not you want to allocate, like, here's this X budget and time that we're going to allocate towards this. And then you'll be able to kind of like layer on like a cake, really, all of these initiatives into everything that you're already doing so that they're all seen together.
So in terms of like measurement for this type of marketing, is it like, are you using sort of the same measuring stick as other brand activations, or is it different? Is it more qualitative? How do you kind of think about that when you're talking to, your exec team?
This is a $1 million mystery, right? Brand heat. How do you gauge brand heat, right? Ultimately, you can have all kinds of bullshit metrics, but did it sell and connect with the audiences, right? And there is no way to project whether or not your brand marketing campaign that like hit somebody in a personal way built that individual brand affinity or not, right? I may see a huge campaign from Ben and Jerry's, right? And be like, wow, it's amazing that they're so like socially responsible and they have all of this. And, I may not go buy the ice cream for months, but every time I go, I look for Ben and Jerry's because I'm a lifelong loyalist based off of that, right? So when you think about what attribution is important with brand heat and brand marketing and what that brings to the value set of the brand, it's actually priceless. Like trying to figure out these metrics is a painful process, right? Like you can do brand lift studies, which in itself is kind of BS in some ways, right? Because you're taking a small group of people and a small group of people's like perceptions of your campaign. And it kind of gives you a little snapshot, but there's no way to really know holistically or even globally because the internet itself is global, right?
And also if you're trying to identify like a specific group and really talk to them, the brand lift study might not even reach those people.
And to your point, you don't ask people what they are. This isn't a government study. And I did a lot of this work actually when I first got here to the Northeast because I wanted to really understand who are consumers in actuality, right? Like you kind of have an idea, but it's a very hard question to answer. And I'm sure we're not the only brand, right? That is constantly on the quest to identify this. And it really, again, having a clear vision of who you want to reach and how you want to reach them, and giving some kind of like qualitative metrics that might help that, like how much reach did it get, how much engagement did it get, right?
Mhm.
And then you look at the kind of engagement it got, right? Like, was it neutral? Was it peer-to-peer sharing? Were people just hype on it and shared it, right? There's so many different ways to kind of view it. And I would say, like, that seems like a fluffy answer, but I think the biggest acknowledgement you can make as a brand marketer or a lifestyle marketer or multicultural marketer is that sometimes you don't have the concrete answer, but you can deduce to a more lasered view of what that snapshot actually looks like, right? Was it effective? Like, were people engaged with it? Did nobody comment on it? Did no one care? And frankly, I'm of the mind, just knowing how controversy works in a positive way, that sometimes when people are actually speaking about something, and maybe even if you have negative, because not everybody has the same opinion, right?
Yeah.
You're still building a view for your brand of something different, right? And finding that balance is always going to be really tough, because not everyone's going to love what you do no matter what. But you have to be resilient, and you have to be brave and bold. And if you're not brave and bold, then you're just going to remain static. So it's also a growth marketing exercise, right? Like, you're growing to a whole different audience.
Yeah, I know we've done some work with some brands who they want to keep it so tight and constrained, and like really reduce the risk and any like liability that comes with speaking to new groups. So they're like, why didn't we get any engagement? Why did nothing happen with this? Like, why was it silent? And we're like, it's silent because no one cared about that TikTok, because it like wasn't interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And
I
I think that's hard for people to rectify, right? They're like, but we're speaking to them. But are you really, you're speaking to them, you're not speaking with them.
Right.
And making content that speaks with an audience is extremely hard, extremely uncomfortable at times, but extremely important for your brand to really break through. And I can't say enough times how really, like, that's the kind of content on the regular, whether it was working entertainment marketing or the brand marketing I'm doing today, the content that was weird, uncomfortable, strange, different, whether people loved or hated it, right? Always made a splash and broke through, because it at least like prompted a conversation, and conversation should be your aim, right? As a brand, because you want people to be discussing these points and issues, and you want to be a vehicle again for that storytelling.
Yeah, totally. I know.
It's a hard one.
I thought about, I lost my thought on that one.
Oh,
it will come back. It'll come back. Awesome. I know we touched briefly on this, but kind of the thinking around, okay, there are these cultural moments kind of baked into the calendars now when we're looking at multicultural marketing, but are we past that, or is that still a good place to start? Kind of how do you think about, are we really going to invest in this month because there's a groundswell around it, or is it more important that we kind of focus elsewhere, and that we're kind of past, naming months? What do you think?
I think we're at an inflection period, actually, because it's kind of past the point of expected and now getting to almost like a point of like scrutiny, right? Like, if you are doing something within that time period, okay, well, are you doing it right? Are you doing the right thing? How are you incorporating it? And, I'm sympathetic, because companies are trying, but may not necessarily know like what the right move is. And frankly, culture is moving quicker than ever. Norms are moving quicker than ever. It's easy to make a mistake, for sure, at a time like this. I think, again, if it's true to what your community and 365 and value set message really is, then go for it, right? Like, we put a lot into our Pride campaign, because we have always championed the queer community. Some of our athletes have been queer. Like, there are just so many things that are very personal to us. And within that, like, we have, product that we've come out with, we have a donation component. So there's all of these things that come together that kind of coalesce why we're doing this. And it will always be an initiative for us throughout the year. Is it going to happen every year? I don't know, right? Like, culturally, it might change, but by the way, like, we're incorporating that into what we're doing step by step anyway. So I do feel like companies have to make a bit of a choice again, right? Like, you can't do it for every single day. I mean, honestly, every month there's a whole different slew of like honorary months, right? And you know, I'm Asian American, and we didn't have as much this year for AAPI month, but I'm like, that's okay, because unless we have something to say or really honoring the community, we did like a quick piece that was really interesting, talking about generational trauma and how the outdoors heals it. That made sense, right? But to go above and beyond in a different way wouldn't have felt as authentic. So I think like when you're looking at some of those things, there has to be a natural tie-in to that month, or to what that month is honoring. But if there isn't, I also think it's okay to sit out, right? As long as you are, again, keyed in on those communities that you really want to like invest in and like honor and like do a little extra work in. And this is not new, like companies have been doing this forever, right? Then I think it's pretty easy for you to be able to prioritize, but I don't think it's a prerequisite every single time. Like you can pick and choose, which is kind of the beauty, but like be always ready for the conversation that will surround that choice.
Yeah, it sounds like too, like, you know, you're really speaking from a place of confidence, which is so important too, because you're like, hey, I know the community, I know the work we're doing, our roots are planted here. I'm going to hear if we're doing, if feedback is negative, like I feel confident that we're going to focus a little bit less on this, but we're going to pursue this. Could you actually, I think it'd be great to have like an example to kind of walk through. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you have done for Pride Month, just to like from a product side, or I think that I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, we released a Pride collection. This is our second year doing it. Yeah, this is our second year doing it. And we also had a partnership with Patagonia. I'm not sure if you're aware of who Patagonia is. Real name Wynn. Yeah. A very wonderful drag queen, but also a huge outdoor advocate, and really has brought a lot from the nonprofit community to the outdoors. Works really closely with a nonprofit called Brave Trails, who we've donated to this month, but also continue to donate to. We have a Explore Fund, which we've had for the last 10 years, which is our nonprofit arm. Not many people know about it, which is good, because that's the way it should be. Yeah. Which has been keyed in on equity in the outdoors and all kinds of different nonprofit organizations, like just helping to donate, grant, and support. So basically, you know, we've worked with Wynn, who's Patty, to create a campaign and these in real life Pride hikes over the next month, which are incredible throughout the US. And we'll invite like people from the community and other people who are just curious about these hikes and want to meet and learn and discuss, you know, just issues or just thoughts within the queer community, be outside and be queer. Yeah. Like we just want to create a gathering space for those people. So, you know, those kind of things coming together, I think are really important, because we're thinking through that. And even with our campaign, you know, behind the lens was a queer photographer. The models were actually some of the people who work at the North Face and who are queer, and also like just other people of the community. So being sure to kind of button all that up to and think through all of that, I think is also really important. It's the small touches that really count in these kind of campaigns, because when the questions come up, when the criticisms arise, you have the answer for that, right? Totally. And it was a consideration, because this is for the community. This is not for us. This is for the community. And we want to make sure to speak with the community, again, through that voice, versus it being like, we're just speaking to the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, that example it makes so much sense for the North Face. You know, it's like, oh, we're going to literally celebrate Pride outdoors through hikes. Like, that's just such a great brand alignment. It's not like, oh, we're going to do a TikTok post with a flag in the background. You know, it's just like, yes, it's truly like the convergence of the brand and the cause, which is awesome. And I did remember what I want to say, which was, you know, you mentioned about like, okay, the actual, like the filmmaker and the creator and the models are all part of this too. I think a lot of brands are really surprised when we tell them like, hey, the creators who are approaching to work with you, they're asking a lot of very pointed questions about what you were doing in this realm. What's your employee training like? What's your employee experience like? Hey, I actually heard this negative feedback about what you all are doing. Like, do you have an answer for that? Or we'd love to kind of talk to your comms team. And a lot of brands are really taken back. It's like, no, it's like, you know, creators really care. Like they want to make sure that they're working with brands who are doing the work too. So I think
it works vice versa too, right?
Totally.
Like we want to have a really strong understanding of the creators that we're working with. And over the last like year and a half, I've launched this through our TikTok channel. We've resourced creators for a bunch of different things, from more commercial uses, right, to display backpacks and talk about backpacks. And then we've also used them, worked with them very closely on like our Discover Your Trail campaign, which was incredible, where we're like asking them, like, why do they go outside, right? And the variety matters, and they have the right to also question us. Like the beautiful thing about the creator marketplace and the way that the creator, economy works is that they have a choice as well of whom they work with. So, when we talk about partners, like that is a partnership as well that needs to be very authentic and real to us too. And I think more companies are looking at the authenticity of that and what it really like says about themselves. And I'm excited to see kind of how that starts to shape up more and more, and how people are more conscious of those values within it.
Yeah, definitely. I know. I think a few brands are like taking it back, but like, oh, we actually have questions for you. And it's like, no, that's how you get to like a really authentic place, because these creators are very heavily vetting the brands that they're working with. Like that means they're not just going to be posting about anyone. So yeah, that's huge. Very cool. Awesome. And then how do you kind of navigate through, the brand and the mission with business objectives? Kind of how do you approach, the ROI part of the conversation?
I think there will always be a tension, and it's trying to drill down, establishing goals from the beginning. And even if those goals are a little bit nebulous or have a little bit less of a a way to calculate them in hard terms, like, did we get the kind of engagement that we're looking for? Did we get the kind of engagement from people of the community that we're looking for, right? What were some of the pull-out feedbacks? Like, we have an athlete team, was the athlete team engaged? Like, for instance, like our athlete team was super engaged with this patty piece. And to me, that's a success, right? Because it shows the loop of the types of partners that we work with and how we're considering who's also important to that athlete team, right? So I think that it's really, it's difficult because yes, of course we have those financial goals, but again, you want to work for a company and you want to align yourself with the company if this is stuff that's important to you, that values that, and it can be more of a dialogue versus a black and white. Because I think that dialogue is really important, and if you prioritize it, money speaks. Dead stop. If you're not putting people of different diverse backgrounds in positions of power and influence, that's another full stop, right? It's really important to be able to kind of seam those things together, and you make a choice. You make a choice of where you put your efforts, and those are things that should matter to you if it does matter to you as an employee, right? Like, and these dialogues are really hard to have sometimes, but when you offset by putting the objectives pretty clear on the board and having maybe 2 or 3 priorities you're trying to hit, I think it makes it easier to kind of assess performance and where it went when you kind of recap on what's happened.
Yeah, you can't boil the ocean, but if you can get 3 things done.
Totally, exactly. And that's okay, right?
Yeah.
But again, I get it. It's really hard because you have to align from the highest levels. And if that's not a priority for the company, then that's a hard thing to rectify with. So it's a question you need to ask yourself too. Like, if that's a value that's very strong with you as a worker, you want to be somewhere where those values are validated, for sure.
Totally. I mean, well, I think we've seen this just with like, I read an article yesterday just about the turnover and like the head of DEI or in multicultural marketing overall, just at these companies where it's just like, hey, we're going to have someone fill this role and solve this problem for us. You're like, actually, that's pretty hard to do at some organizations. So kind of what would you, yeah, sorry.
No, at many organizations. And there's this whole theory, there's a Harvard business review study that these 2 Black women actually, formulated, that has this concept, pet the threat, where, a lot of people are hired for their backgrounds and their strong work in DEI. And then they come in and they're like, yes, this is amazing. This is like, a pet to the organization. And then when they actually ask for the money and try to do it and then embed themselves in marketing, which I think is the most influential way that you can actually affect that work, then they're stonewalled. And now when that happens, that really is kind of an indicator that maybe you're not ready to do this work, right? Because the money and the influence talk. And without those things, then you're not really investing in that work within your organization.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that with like a client would be like, oh, we really want to, we want diversity, we want diversity of thought, of story, of background. And we're like, here are the creators for you. And they're like, actually, like,
Yeah, they're like too far, too far.
that's a bit extreme. We're like, what? This is like, so, and then you mentioned just like, money talks. And it's really cool that the North Face has this nonprofit arm. How important do you think that it's basically like mission critical for a brand to have either nonprofit arm themselves, or that they are actively donating money to causes? Do you think you can do multicultural marketing without that in a good way? Or kind of what are your thoughts there on donations and giving?
Having your own nonprofit is a pain in the ass, as I've come to find out myself. It is a lot
Pro
of
tip.
work. Yeah, a lot of work and way more complex than you think. So I actually don't think that it is critical that an organization has their own nonprofit arm. If they're willing to, again, substantiate the budget and put together like ways to do it right, awesome, right?
Mhm.
Again, it's embedded in what we do. So that was an easy kind of like pivot in that sense for us. But I do think aligning with a few nonprofits that make sense for your organization and the mission of your organization, never a bad thing, right? Like, on the Asian American collective side, we have a lot of PR companies and marketing companies that reach out because clients want to align with nonprofits.
Yeah.
And if they're aiming for the Asian creative community, well, I'm your girl, right? We're here. So I love seeing that, because I'm not mad at organizations that don't have $5 million to donate every year. But I do think it's great when I see these organizations that might make sense for us kind of coming in, like willing to input even a little bit of budget into a particular initiative or work with us directly. So I think that all of that kind of alignment counts. And the basic thing is that when you're giving money to a nonprofit organization that's reaching a certain kind of community, you're helping people who are actually doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And you're extending your ability to help in that storytelling by helping those organizations where they're doing it. So I think it's actually a really good thing to have a consciousness of this, and almost like a bank of different nonprofits or community organizations you're working with, depending obviously on the scope of your business, because it's just the right thing to do, right? Like you're if you have a business, you're trying to like sell a product or do a thing, right? You can't do everything. And it just makes a ton of sense to actually align with people who values wise feel like great partners for you.
So it's cool that because you've been on both sides of it in terms of like brands supporting nonprofits and nonprofits wanting to partner with brands. If you were on the brand side, do you have any advice for brands in trying to vet and choose the nonprofits that they decide to align with?
I mean, again, do they align with your values and the future of your company? Is there a pipeline within what they're doing for future employees or people who would be invested in your companies too, right? Like, one thing that's really interesting is like companies will sometimes donate to us on the Asian American collective side, and they also have people we would want in our group. So we also use it as a vehicle to be like, hey, if any of the people within your organization are looking to join a resource, we can also be a resource to you. So I do think like there's a few different things that an organization like that can be beneficial to you for, right? And establishing that relationship is super important. But I mean, you want to make sure there's no controversy. You want to know what their aims are, their pillars. Like I've built countless decks around this. And, it really does get you thinking when you are an organization, like, what are our three aims, right? Like, and I use a lot of the brand marketing expertise that I bring from my day job, right, into this, because I'm like, here's 3 pillars. We're focused on mentorship, education, and advocacy. And once you can kind of give your elevator pitch like that, it makes a lot of sense to the brand that's willing to donate, right? So I think that that's really important, that you also see that the organization you're working with has a very clear mission, has kind of like, has at least like some kind of like stats or understanding of like what programs have looked like in the past. And that you have like, you feel that mutual connection and a little bit of that good working relationship, because that's extremely important. Like you don't want to donate your money and then never hear again. Like you also want to make sure that there is kind of an open line of communication there too.
And then I guess on the flip side, if you're on the nonprofit looking at the brands you want to work with, what do you think like kind of the best ways to set up that relationship so you're getting the most out of the brand partnership?
Yeah, I think this is a very good one. I mean, it's different for everybody. Just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean that it necessarily makes sense for us, right? I think the biggest thing is also having, when you're a nonprofit, having a value set to really kind of work around. I actually just did this work for us. So, again, like working in brand marketing really got me thinking about what are our values and who do we partner with and why, right? And we partner with other people who are championing the future of the Asian American creative community, but are also acting as empowering allies to other BIPOC and marginalized communities as well. So if you're just keyed in on Asians, but don't care about the rest of the world, you're maybe not for us, right?
Mhm.
Because that's not what we're trying to do. But I think having those parameters are really important because it really makes you question every opportunity that comes your way and say, hey, are we looking at it through this lens? Does this fulfill this lens? And once you have that, it really helps you to vet and say yes and no to opportunities that, may look sexy on paper, but we're probably not going to partner with an oil and gas company anytime soon, or evil corporations. Like, it's just not going to happen for us. But I think once you have that too, it's very helpful as a nonprofit organization because it allows you to find the best partners that align with your values.
Yeah. Have you found anything like surprising in your current role? Like anything you were like, oh, I didn't think this would be part of the job or anything?
I wouldn't say that, I'm ready for anything. I came from music, so it's a shit show every day. But I would say that what I was surprised about is the amount of random people who come for big companies like us on social platforms for a multitude of reasons. You are not prepared for any day for anything that could happen. And sometimes it's hella quiet. Sometimes nothing is going on. I mean, obviously I started and have survived through probably one of the most tumultuous times on social media here, which I can pat my own self on the back, making it through COVID, Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate. We had multiple things that have bubbled up with the oil and gas community, with other lawsuits and just weird things and infringements on our logo. Endless things that have happened and accusations that are clearly wrong, but we have to really handle it in a very delicate way and work very closely with PR to make sure that we're, PR in our corporate companies to make sure that we're giving the right response. So I learned a lot about crisis communications, obviously, and the vehicle that it takes through social media through this was not always knew that something could happen, right? But with the craziest situations on earth happening during this time, I feel pretty much like a ninja. I can basically take anything on and at least have a point of view of how to solve an issue. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably the biggest kind of surprise in this role for sure for me.
Awesome.
Well, hi, you guys. That was amazing. And if people can throw stones at a fabulous company like either of yours, I don't know what's going on with the world. So I love that you are a pro-social ninja. And I frankly thought that was a great conversation, as always. I want to just recap a couple things that Zeena said, like we're all multicultural these days. Exactly. She made the point that inclusion marketing takes embracing constant checks and balances, right? And even if you build on it little by little, but you have to prioritize it year round versus having commemorative months. Those were just a few of the takeaways. So I want to thank you so much, May and Zeena, from Obviously and the North Face respectively, for your time today and your brilliant input. Thank you so much.
Awesome job, Zeena.